This week I'm catching up with an old friend here that we worked on last fall, and we're going to get a bit more in-depth on the subject of frets and fretting. The patient will be familiar to many thousands of you. This is a mid-50s Les Paul Jr., which has had a colorful life, to put it mildly. You'll recall that the top end of the neck had been replaced with a graft, and there was no headstock facing. After I replaced that and played it, I mentioned how low the frets were. So the owner took it home. He wanted to see what it was like with those low frets, and agreed. Those frets are too low. When dealing with guitar setups and fittings, there are very few absolutes. You know, there are people who use super heavy strings and an action that would result in immediate tendon damage for the average player. That's what they like. It's what they need to get their sound. There are others on the other side of the spectrum who have super light touch and an action that's so low that it causes, like, insufferable buzzing in the hands of anyone else. There are some general observations I've made, though, and it seems to me that about 90% of the population requires a fret that's at least 25 thousandths tall. That's 0.6 millimeters. Anything less than that, and the playing experience gets so annoying that they don't want to play the instrument. Let's have a look here with the old calipers again. As always, there are exceptions. If you delve into vintage guitars for any length of time, you'll hear about fretless wonders, which is a term that's often associated with the Gibson Les Paul Customs, the so-called Black Beauty guitars of the late 1950s. This would not have been a fretless wonder when it was made in 1955. It was close to that era. Anyway, you'll also hear that term used to describe various 1970s models with low, wide frets. How low? What size? That can be difficult information to obtain. If you plug the words fretless wonder into a search engine, you'll get no reliable information of real value. I don't know what the factory fret height was on a 1957 Custom. I suspect it was between 25 thousandths and 30 thousandths. Les Paul, the musical namesake, did like lower than typical frets. There are enough reels and shorts featuring him going around now that if you ingest guitar content on any social media, they're going to be served up to you at some point in your feed. Old black and white videos, films, kinescopes, whatever. He played what at the time might have been described as hot guitar, popular jazz standards. He was very flashy, a lot of quick hand movements up and down the neck, playing octaves with fingers that are like light as a feather. You know, the thing about a low fret is that it provides little resistance to that kind of position shifting. There's nothing getting in the way of your fingertips. It's just like running over a smooth road. What it can make difficult is string bending. Now, Les liked low action, and he didn't do very much of that. A lot of slides and glissandi, but no big bluesy bends, more than about a quarter tone. So what makes low frets hard to deal with? Well, on the repair side of things, there's just like very little material to dress if they get worn or they're out of level. They can also feel harder to note cleanly, which is very paradoxical. But sometimes it feels like you actually have to press harder to get a clean sound. They can get low enough that unless you've got very accurate finger placement right up close to the fret, the angle of the string might not make solid contact. Let's look at a diagram. Being only 16 thousandths, which is 0.4 millimeters tall, with a normal action, if you press the string down in the middle of the space between frets, which is sometimes necessary when you're doing certain chords, you might not generate enough downward pressure on the fret to produce a clean tone. In this case, it might be better to have no frets at all. It's helpful to scope out the line of the fretboard with a notched straight edge before we take the strings off. So we want to make sure that there isn't excessive relief in the neck or forward bow when it's at tension. If there is, then we can adjust it straight. If the truss rod is maxed out, however, we might actually loosen it off a little and resign ourselves to dressing material off of the fingerboard to make it closer to straight and keep some adjustment in reserve. This neck is not bad. There is some relief in it. It's focused primarily around up farther ahead than I would like to see. It's around frets 11 and 12 is kind of the focus. I'd much prefer it if it was down around like 6 or 7, but it is what it is. Let's talk about fret size. This has original 50s frets in it, which are going to be somewhere close to 80 thousandths of an inch wide, which is about 2 millimeters. I remembered I have this little sample board I made up of all the fret wires I keep on hand. Being a repair shop, I need them all because I'm often doing things like a partial refret where I have to match the size as close as possible because it's, you know, going to be sitting next to older frets. This has everything from mandolin wire through the small vintage wire like you would find on this guitar here, you know, stuff that's 80 thousandths wide, to a more modern medium-sized wire, which might be around 92, 95 thousandths. Got the vintage Gibson jumbo wire, which is around 103 thousandths wide. Then on up to the modern jumbo wire, which is astronomically huge. Those are 110 thousandths wide by 55 thousandths tall, which is just, it's a railroad track. There's also a medium stainless on here too. The stainless is slightly more gray or blue in its reflection than the nickel silver, which has this kind of light yellow cast to it. This has been sitting around in the drawer of my intake bench for a long time now because I learned pretty quickly that maybe showing it to someone who's in for a refret is not such a great idea. Like, the overabundance of choice causes a kind of selection paralysis. They'll pick one and then I'll get an email later that night saying, hey, maybe perhaps the next size up. They'll have second guessed themselves and they'll want to change. And then later that week another email will come and they'll want to go back to the initial size. So it's best, I think, to ask if, you know, should we use a similar size to what came on the guitar? Most people will say yes, and they'll be very happy. Fret height is another thing of which there are many variables. Most modern fret wire is sold, it comes between about 40 thousandths to 50 thousandths of an inch tall. That's the crown, not the entire height of the fret, which includes the tang. That's about 1 millimeter to about 1.2 millimeter. The jumbo wire can be up to 55 thousandths of an inch tall, that's pretty tall. There are also lower examples of these wire, which are designed for use in refretting again, so you don't have to remove as much material to get down to the height of the pre-existing frets on the guitar. So, you know, fret height is one thing, fret width is another. Intuitively, you might expect narrower frets to play more accurately in tune, and that can be true to a point in the long run. Wide frets have more mass under the string, and they definitely feel different. And as they wear down, there's maybe more room for the notes to drift and play sour. The thing is, Gibson was not super concerned with recrowning their jumbo frets into perfect semi-circular cross-section. You know, the corners were just knocked off after they were filed and sanded over, but they tended to be fairly flat on top. That can cause some tuning issues. So let's look at another diagram. On a fret that has been filed flat and not recrowned, we have a situation where the string will be taking off at a point farther from the bridge than the mathematical ideal, which would be right in the center of the fret. A full millimeter or more in distance, that's a lot where fret accuracy is concerned. That note will play significantly flat. Another thing that can occur with wide, uncrowned frets is a weird kind of buzz that may deceive you into thinking you have a high fret, but in reality, the free length of string will flap against the flat spot, like on a sitar bridge. We can talk about material briefly. I mentioned in a recent video that standard frets are made from an alloy of copper and nickel. I looked it up, and it turns out that Dunlop still makes some frets with 12% nickel. I've never purchased it. Most of them on the market are 18% nickel. And there are some newish alternatives too. About 10 or 12 years ago, stainless steel frets started becoming quite popular. Stainless steel is harder than standard wire. I'd say much harder. It's much more time consuming to work with due to that fact. Filing it takes considerably longer. It can also be rougher on the tools. Beyond that, some people say that they can hear a qualitative difference in the tone. All I can say is that the guitars I've made with it and refretted with it have sounded good. You know, it's not, I don't know if it's psychosomatic or not. There are some other alloys, which I don't have here at the moment because nobody ever asks for them. There's a product called EVO wire from Jescar, which is a really bright yellow gold in color. It's a special alloy that's hyperallergenic for people who have problems with nickel. That wire is somewhere between nickel and stainless in terms of hardness. Do the stainless frets last longer? In my experience, definitely yes. I have refretted instruments for pro players who have brought a guitar back to me after 5 or 6 years of continuous play, like daily play, with only the slightest amount of wear visible on them. So I do charge more for stainless jobs because, you know, the material itself is more expensive, it takes longer, and it's more annoying, and, you know, it'll wear down my fretting tools faster. So I got to recoup that cost somehow. What's there to say about removing frets? I lightly score the edges with a sharp scalpel, I heat them up, I try and lift one corner, which can be pretty difficult with super low wire like this. In some cases I'll use the StewMac fret removal chip stopper, which sort of surrounds the tang and provides a bearing surface for the puller and makes things come out pretty clean. I need to clean out the fret slots with this little hooked tool that I made. After some consideration, I've decided to go with the Stuart McDonald number 152 wire, which is slightly wider and slightly taller than the vintage stuff, but not too much taller or too much wider. It's still what we'd consider a medium size, and I think the owner will be quite happy with this. Another decision to make is whether we want to sand this entire surface of the fretboard so that it's back down to clean wood and get rid of some fairly significant wear in the lower positions. This is Brazilian rosewood. It's darkened to a chocolate brown color. If we were to do that, well, we'd have to remove quite a significant amount of wood. These dot markers are actually fairly thin, and in one case it looks like it's almost been sanded through. Also, we end up getting very close to the side dot markers. By the time I've taken off another 15 thousandths to get to the bottom of the ruts in the fingerboard, we'd be sanding into those. So this is a decision. You know, it's an aesthetic decision, it's a functional decision. In this case, the neck is playing pretty well. It's not twisted or anything, and I think that I can actually straighten it out slightly using compression fretting rather than sanding all the way through this venerable surface. Okay, I'm going to use my fret bender here, put a radius on this. I'm going to start off with very little pressure and sneak up to the radius I want, because I recall reading an article from Dan Earlywine who said they were doing some testing on regular nickel silver frets, and by passing it through the die multiple times it ends up being a sort of work hardening effect, and he contended that he could make the standard nickel silver fret much harder by doing this, and therefore longer lasting. I mean it's not going to be like stainless steel, but it will be harder, which is a good thing. So when I'm done with the bending, I'm going to want to see a little bit of an air gap between the underside of the tang and the center of the fretboard. So it's contacting on the edges rather than all along its length. That means when I push this down into the slot and hammer it out, it's going to compress a bit in the center, and the studs on the tang are going to move slightly sideways into the wood, giving us a good firm seating effect. I'm going to cut the frets to length. I'll leave them about 3/16 of an inch oversize, thereabouts. Snip them off. I use a good set of channel lock. These are number 357 end nippers. I reserve my super high quality StewMac flush cutters for actual flush cutting. I want to hold on to those for as long as possible, and I store them in the block here, mostly to preserve a sense of rhythm when you're doing the fretwork. It's hard to describe, and I don't think it naturally gets shown when I'm doing the videos because I'm constantly stopping to change angles and stuff, but really you want to get yourself into a flow state where everything happens exactly the same, so there's consistency from fret to fret and less opportunity to make mistakes. It's useful to remember that if you're going to try and refret a Gibson Les Paul or one of these guitars with 22 frets, that if you try and make it with two 24 lengths of wire, it's not going to happen. You're going to end up with this much left in your hand and 1 fret left to go. So you're going to have to invest in 3 lengths of wire, or be like me and save your offcuts, carefully labeled for just such an occasion. I'm going to clear out the fret slots. I've set the stop on this back saw here so that it is just deeper by about 0.02 than the tang on the frets. Oftentimes these boards will be cut deeper than necessary. That's fine, but I don't want it to get hung up on some schmutz or whatever's in the, in the bottom of the slot there. So gentle, a couple of passes. If this was a bound board, I'd be using my Dremel tool in a base with a very small bit to bring up any material that's caught in there. I protect the edge of the guitar with a piece of steel when I'm doing the upper frets here. And clean the surface of the board. Okay, got my mise en place, which I set up in the same way every time. Got my block of frets. There's a spray bottle of water for cleanup. It's a very old bottle, and when the nozzle starts to crack, I glue it all back together again. There's a syringe with fish glue. I always wrap the headstock of Les Pauls and similar guitars with some paper towels for padding, just as a precaution, because it ends up being fairly close to the base of my bench vise here. I've never had the two intersect before, but I'm still not taking chances. Fairly low neck rest for this size of guitar. There's a stack of paper towels torn into little squares for cleaning up the glue. To my right, I have a little platform where I toss heavy items that are kind of pointy and I don't want them falling anywhere near the guitar. So there's my handheld fret press here. This is not the Stuart McDonald model. This was made by a machinist here in Ontario. The site is guitarbuilderonline.com. Not a sponsor. It's actually got a new model out now with rubber hand grips that looks pretty cool. They also made my fret bender. So, I mean, they're good tools, very reasonably priced. So I've also got my hammer here. I use a nylon-faced hammer. Never have a problem denting the frets or the fingerboard. It's what I'm used to. Okay, so I've shown all of this so many times in recent months, weeks, forever, that it should be old hat to most of you. Put a little fish glue. I like the fish glue. I think it creates a better connection between the fret and the fret slot. Seems to be less loss of energy transfer. I hear a difference when I use the glue, so I do. There are people who don't use the glue. That's fine too. So, got my 12-inch radius press and call into the device here, and takes a little bit of sort of setup to figure out where exactly you want the clamp pressure. You don't really want it to clunk closed. This is just a press. Clean off the glue, squeeze out, and then give a visual check to make sure that the fret is seated all the way along its length. Okay, having done the frets at the top end of the board, I'm going to have a quick look again with the notch straight edge to see what's going on. And I'm noticing that the locus for the relief is still up here, frets 11, 12 area. So what I'm going to try and do is actually do some localized back bowing in this area by expanding the tang of those frets. So I got fret number 10 here, and again using my little expanding pliers, which have the point on one end and a little groove on the other, I'm going to grab the tang and slightly deform it, making this fret a tighter fit in the slot, which when I put it in is actually going to expand or push the sides of the fret slot away from each other, and that's what's going to affect the outward pressure. And we're going to see if we can get rid of this little bit of a kink that's going on up here. Of course, when I'm talking and doing this stuff, I always end up using way too much glue. Be more frugal. The occasional use of a fret rocker can help. I'll come back here and clean up any glue squeeze out along the frets. This board shows evidence of having been treated with linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, a lot over the years. That stuff, as it ages, it gets really, really dark, and the surface can become kind of sticky if you use too much of it. It's a sort of characteristic kind of feeling, almost like the wood is kind of like rotten. It's not, but it's just the feeling of it. So it's one of the reasons I don't use the linseed oil. I just don't like how it ages. Got the fancy nippers out. Couple of things. I always do these with the jaws sort of vertical as opposed to horizontal. Number one, this keys off the edge of the board. It registers things a bit more straight. And you have to be careful, because if you do it this way, there's a tendency to pull up and maybe loosen the end of the fret. I find this is a bit more secure. Like I always say, make sure you catch all of the little nubbins here, because you don't want these guys underneath a guitar subsequently, because they'll do extreme damage. I'm filing off the excess. I stop before the file is actually rubbing on the fingerboard surface. The last time I worked on this guitar, I made a rather nice nut for it, and I know that it's now going to be too low by about 20 thousandths of an inch, half a millimeter or so. So I'm going to shim it rather than make a whole brand new one. A piece of bone here, which I've thinned down on my sander to about 25 thousandths thick, so a little leeway. At these thicknesses, it's very, very fragile stuff, so got to be careful. I'm going to use some super glue and stick that down. Act as a human clamp for a little while. Yeah, I could use accelerator, but that stuff stinks. I'll cut off the excess. After some filing and sanding, I think it looks pretty nice. So I'm going to angle the ends of the frets inwards using this, which is just a block of wood which holds a file at an angle. There are some things to know about that, which might be better done in a diagram. I suppose the greatest takeaway is that there might not be one single perfect angle for the fret ends. Much depends on the width of the neck and how close the strings ride to the edge of the fingerboard. Sometimes you'll see me using the file holder, other times I'm freehanding it because I need less angle based on the way the strings are situated on the nut and the saddle. The other thing is, if you're using a taller fret wire and the same angle block, it's just naturally going to produce a longer ramp, and it'll be farther in from the edge of the board. So, you don't want that to end up under the E string. Here I'm using the sharply tapered end of a spear point file to dress off the tiny remnant of fret tang that's protruding out beyond the edge of the fingerboard. Okay, I'm setting up my neck jig. The guitar has been under string tension for a while now to come up and settle into its usual shape. This thing is a platform that holds the guitar steady. This is a band clamp. There's padding to make sure it's not cutting into the finish or the edges of the guitar. There are several props which I deploy under the neck to hold it in its current configuration, and then I can take the string tension off and it will remain in the shape that it has when it's under tension, thereby making leveling the frets a lot easier and more accurate. This is apt to be a bit confusing, but a Gibson neck usually has a continuous, unchanging radius from the nut to its end, at least in this era. By holding my dressing beam parallel to the edges of the board and having the strokes diverge as they go upwards and reach the body, I'm effectively planing a very subtle compound radius into the fret tops. So the radius at the body end might be 14 inches versus the 12 at the nut. This can make bending strings a little easier in the higher positions, a little cleaner. As usual, I prefer a homemade triangular file with the corners ground safe to do my recrowning. I like the level of control it affords. Then I gotta polish them up. And polish and polish. Using another safe edge file, I take off the sharp corner where the fret end meets the edge of the fingerboard. If you don't do this, your finger will catch on it and it's very annoying, very sharp. Then I round off the rest of the fret end with a rolling, arcing motion. There are a number of different ways to finish the ends of the frets. This is my preferred shape. Some people like less of a rounded edge. Others like almost a semi-hemispherical shape. And finally, I'll polish off the ends with some micro mesh abrasive in a very high grit. This is 8000. So there we are. New frets. A little taller, a little wider, a little more round. Consequently, the action is a little lower, and it feels quite a bit different from previous. I think it feels better. And this thing's probably ready for another 60 years of rock and roll.